Yo, what's up everyone? My name is Yura, and we are back once again for another month of Meadowlands deck profile, and I could not be happier with the deck that we are showcasing today. This is Counter Fairy, and you might have seen in the thumbnail, maybe the title, I don't know what I'm going to name this yet, but you definitely see it in the side deck. Don't worry about it. We'll get to this later. But Counter Fairy is a really interesting little set of cards in Meadowlands. I'm going to be fully honest and upfront with this. I do not think this build is done yet. There are a lot of decent actual counter traps in the format, and it's really hard to decide which ones are actually worth sticking in and which ones are not. Even some of the actual Counter Fairy like package cards, I'm also not fully convinced by, but there are a lot of things that we can mess with here that I think leads to a lot of different variations of a build like this. I think a big thing of this build specifically is the Sanctuary in the Sky stuff. I don't know if this is actually optimal, but it is a card that has a lot of really interesting little pieces around it, and I think it is absolutely worth labbing. That said, there are other counter traps that could find their way into this build. Things like Drastic Drop-Off are pretty solid. For a while, we were on things like, where is it? Blackhorn of Heaven, I think is fine. There's a lot of decent counter traps in the room that are potentially worth finding a slot for. Debunk is another solid one too, but that's more of a side deck card, I think. There's a lot to be done here. That said, I have currently been tinkering with this list. Shout out to Negate Attack for being a very funny card here, but this list feels a little confused. And a big reason for that is Vandalgyon, the Dark Dragonlord, which I guess we're just going to start off with the card by card here and go through it, because this is one of those decks that just kind of makes sense as you go through the card by card. A lot of these cards are pretty self-explanatory, and unlike a lot of the other decks that we've been covering recently, things like Zeal Gigas, this is one of those decks that a card by card is perfectly serviceable for understanding how a deck is meant to function. So we're going to start off with Vandalgyon. This is in theory your boss monster of the deck, but it is a little weird to field. Vandalgyon reads as a level 8 Dark Dragon monster. If you negate the activation of an opponent's spell, trap, or opponent's monster effect with a counter trap card, except during the damage step, you can special summon this card from your hand. If summoned this way, you can activate these effects and resolve in sequence, depending on the type of cards negated by that counter trap. If it's a spell, you burn for 1500 damage, pretty decent. If it's a trap, you target a card your opponent controls and destroy it, really decent. And if it's a monster, you can target a monster in your graveyard and special summon it, very decent, very, very good. The problem with this is that you need to be specifically running counter traps that negate spells, traps, activations, or opponent's monster effects. And believe it or not, there aren't actually a lot of those that help keep you in the game. They don't do anything to help you like equalize a board state. If you fall behind and you're negating like a spell or a monster effect, that's not going to be enough to like, you know, defeat a Machina Fortress from just punching you in the face. So it's a little strange playing around this card. There are a couple of other boss monsters that you could in theory run that also work with counter traps, things like Voltanis the Educator, but Voltanis requires you to get rid of your counter fairies on board, which is not ideal because those are your main advantage engines. You could also run Dark Voltanis, which is okay, but it doesn't really work because all of your main deck monsters apart from your boss are lights. So you're just, you can't really summon it that easily. And unfortunately, because the counter fairy monsters are relatively small, it's not like Rock Stun or Rock Control, however we're going to call that, where you can just kind of play a low to the ground game with them because they don't really clear a lot of the important monsters in the format. The biggest one among them isn't even really a counter fairy monster. We're on Zeradius, Herald of Heaven, as a 3-of to search out our Sanctuary in the Sky, and he caps out at 2100, and there isn't really a good way of getting over that. So the main reason that we're on Vandalgyon at all is to try and clear these bigger monsters, because otherwise you really don't have a good way of doing so. That said, I do think Vandalgyon is a very, very cool boss monster, and I do think there is a world in which we swap out some of these counter traps to better facilitate Vandalgion actually hitting the board, because you're going to see in the replays when we get to them that it is a little weird to play around when your main tempo control is things like negate attack or forced back, which do not trigger the Vandalgion. That said, I do still like the card a lot, and I do think it is absolutely worth playing. We're just gonna have to probably touch up the counter trap lineup to make it a little more consistent. So finding the balance there is definitely a weird part of building this deck. I already touched on these Zeratius, so we're not going to go over it too much. It's a Sanctuary in the Sky Searcher, and much like the other field spell searchers from this era, if that field spell is not on the field, it blows itself up. But otherwise, it's just kind of a 2100 beater. You can, in theory, make a rank 4 with it, but the rank 4 toolbox in this deck is it's not super important. Most of these cards don't need to be here. I'm going to be super for real. They don't come up a whole lot. On to the actual counter fairies that we're on 2 of them. Technically, there are a couple of others. You could play Layard the Liberator. We're not doing that because we don't have a lot of fairies that are going to get banished. I think this is better in a world that you are playing the agents, specifically if you're on double agent of Mercury, Earth, and a Master Hyperion. I think that is a solid variant for you to be playing the Layard, but other than that, I don't really think it's super worth it. I will say, I do think Master Hyperion as a separate boss monster instead of Vandalgion is a very interesting concept, and it is something that I do want to mess around with, but it is not currently a part of this build. One of the things that I actually really love about this deck is that there are seemingly a bunch of different ways to go about building it, and this is certainly one of them. Certainly is one of them. We'll touch on the side deck in a bit. Don't worry about it. But we're on 3 copies of Bountiful Artemis. This is your main advantage engine. Bountiful Artemis reads, each time a counter trap is activated, immediately after it resolves, you can draw a card. This card allows you to replace the counter trap that you just activated while the counter trap is ideally interrupting your opponent. This is really fun to activate with a thing like negate attack, because if your opponent is just trying to run over the Bountiful Artemis and you flip the negate attack, you end the battle phase and you're getting an additional draw off of it. So it is another means with which to like stay in the game. I think this works really, really well with forced back. These are more, I mean, they're all reactive by nature, it being counter traps, but I do think this helps fix the kind of tempo issue that this deck was having prior to the inclusion of negate attack and forced back. Although forced back has been in here for a while. The only other counter fairy that we are on is Meltiel, Sage of the Sky, and Meltiel is the main reason that we are on Sanctuary in the first place. Meltiel is doing its best impression of the Labyrinth field spell, not the Gate Guardian one, the castle, you know. Meltiel reads, each time a counter trap is activated, immediately after it resolves, gain 1,000 life. And if you do, if the Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field, destroy a card your opponent controls. This is really, really sick. This turns Meltiel and all of your counter traps into removal. This is phenomenal. This is like genuinely unbelievable. It's one of the main reasons why I think this deck is so interesting, because pairing Meltiel with the Sanctuary, any of these counter traps actually help you reactively, admittedly, eat through a board, which is exactly what this deck needs to try and stay in a game. Because otherwise, if you're just worrying about like Bountiful Artemis and you're playing the agent stuff instead, you don't really have a good way of additionally capitalizing off of your counter trap activations. A lot of these counter traps require you to lose hand advantage in order to activate them, like Judgment of Anubis and Divine Wrath, both requiring a discard. Between Bountiful Artemis and Meltiel, you are evening out that advantage deficit by either destroying your opponent's cards with Meltiel or drawing to replace those cards with Bountiful Artemis. And I think these two are really, really sick. I think they're very fun to mess with. And then finally, rounding out our monsters, we're on 1 copy of Honest to try and keep our counter fairies alive for just a little bit longer. There is another potential counter fairy you could run here. It's not technically a counter fairy, although it is in like the purest sense in that it cares about counter traps and is a fairy. Harvest Angel of Wisdom is in theory a way of recycling your counter traps, which is decent, but this card only works when it is destroyed by battle. And in a world where we have Fire Fist and Spellbook and Mermail. I don't think that's worth relying on, being perfectly honest. It's a decent body. 1800's not terrible, so that's something, I guess. Onto the spells. There aren't that many of them. We're on 1 Dark Hole, 1 Reborn. The Heavy Storm is currently in the side to complete our Trinity. Because believe it or not, you don't want to blow up your own back row. But we're also on double duality because you don't do a whole lot of special summoning except for exactly the Vandalgion. We're on 3 copies of MST to try and help equalize the board state if we are forced to go second. We're on 3 copies of Sanctuary in the Sky because we always want to find it, which is why we're also on 3 Zeradius. Could honestly also potentially play Terraforming, but that gets to the weird point where you just don't have enough trap cards to, facilitate your trap strategy. So I don't think it's very good personally. Onto the traps. These are the real stars of the show. We're on double bottomless. This is a tempo card. It's not a counter trap, but it does help. It deals with Fire Fist, and that's kind of a deck that we fear a lot. Onto the counter traps, though. That is the only normal trap in the entire deck. We've got 3 negate attack, which is really solid for staying in a game and trying to keep tempo online. We've got the 1 judgment, the 1 warning, because they're counter traps and they're phenomenal, although they don't work with Vandalgion unless they are specifically negating a spell or a trap. We're on 3 copies of Forced Back, another card that does not work with Vandalgion, but is great for tempo. We're on 3 copies of Divine Wrath to deal with monster-related strategies. This is solid for a lot of decks, but is only really good when you're going first, which is kind of unfortunate. We're on 3 copies of Judgment of Anubis, and I think this card is very, very cool. It's kind of like the shining light in the darkness for this deck, because otherwise you would be eaten alive by the 3 copies of MST and the 1 Heavy Storm. Judgment of Anubis reads, if when your opponent activates a spell card that would destroy a spell trap on the field, you can discard a card, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. Then you can destroy a face-up monster your opponent controls, and if you do that, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the destroyed monster's attack on the field. That is a lot of effects on this card. Not only does it protect your back row from all of the insane amount of back row removal that exists in this format, but it also helps equalize a board state. And when you're pairing this with things like Artemis and Meltiel Sage of the Sky, Artemis is replacing the discard, and Meltiel turns this into 2 pops, one of which is burning for that monster's attack. That's unbelievable. That's so good. The final counter trap in the main deck is the 2 copies of Divine Punishment. This is arguably the strongest counter trap in the deck, but it is only online while Sanctuary in the Sky is active. Specifically, Divine Punishment reads, when a spell, trap card, or monster effect is activated while Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field, you can negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. It is solemn judgment for having Sanctuary online. Ideally, we're going to have Sanctuary online a lot, but if you draw this card without Sanctuary, it is fully a dead card that does nothing, which is why we're only on the 2. Onto the extra deck, most of these cards do not matter. You could swap these in and out. I think the only ones that are important here are the Gem Knight Pearl for killing Ovion, double Fire Fist Tiger King for the side deck, the double Diamond Direwolf for the side deck, the Black Ship of Corn for removing Maystrokes, and 1 or 2 Maystrokes for surviving. You could also argue that Cowboy is relevant here for closing out games. The rest of this, completely up to you. I think you could run a bunch of different cards in these slots, and I would not argue with you whatsoever. I think Chain is decent here to, in theory, get you access to one of your counter fairies, but to make the chain, you would have had to already have counter fairies on board. So really, what are we doing here? They're fine. They're fine cards. But genuinely, the extra deck is very much up to you. I think most of these cards do not matter. If you are playing the Master Hyperion package with the Agent of Earth, I think you probably want to add a couple of synchros to this deck. You could also play Malefic Stardust Dragon, if I can type. Wow, I really can't type. Malefic Stardust Dragon is a decent card, and it was in here for a bit to protect your Sanctuary in the Sky. This card banishes a Stardust Dragon from your extra deck, restricts you to only having 1 Malefic on your field, and it's the only thing that can attack, but it protects your field spells from being destroyed by card effects, which is very relevant. And then if there's no face-up field spell on the field, destroy this card. This is very much a Malefic card. This card is fine. This is the other boss monster that we were running alongside the Vandalgion. We took it out for space reasons, but I think if you wanted to play a monster to protect your Sanctuary in the Sky that is making use out of the fact that your extra deck really doesn't matter a whole lot, Malefic Stardust could be worse. Now on to the side deck. So before we get into the actual side deck proper, I want to discuss why the side deck is the way that it is. So Counter Fairy is innately a deck that is really, really weak going second, and for pretty obvious reasons. Any trap deck has an inherent disadvantage for going second into any deck because your opponent already has the ability to set up on their turn, and a lot of your traps are reactive in nature, so they're not like available to you until turn 3. That is where this package in the side deck comes in. And I say package, this is a full-blown smokescreen. We are smokescreening into Fire Fist in this deck. Fire Fist as a side deck smokescreen here is relevant for a few reasons. One, this is a package of cards that does really solid at playing a neutral game, either going first or second. What I mean by this is that because of Bear and Gorilla's just inherent ability to be both removal and advantage engines on their own, this is a very compact advantage engine that can work really well on its own. And when supplementing it with the really solid trap card lineup here, I think this deck is actually really interesting. The side out strategy for this Fire Fist package would be to remove all of the Sanctuary in the Sky cards. So the Zeratius, the Sanctuary, and the Divine Punishments alongside the Counter Fairies themselves can all leave. They're not really super relevant. You could in theory adjust this based on matchups if you wanted to keep like Artemis in, but you should absolutely be removing the Meltiel if you are removing these Sanctuaries. You could remove the Vandalgions if you wanted to. I think this is definitely still early in testing, but in theory, it's really interesting. The second reason I think this is good is because Fire Fist as a deck in this format is already really content running trap cards as a backup plan. The actual Fire Fist strategy is making use out of things like Debris Dragon and Raven for additional advantage, and their trap lineup is a little bit more specifically tailored to helping them win combat and accrue advantage. But honestly, having these counter traps isn't the worst backup plan for Fire Fist. I think things like Negate Attack and Forced Back work really nicely here. And even though you don't have the Bountiful Artemis in theory to help you get the Divine Wraths and Judgment of Anubis's costs back, you are still working off of that same base theory of Fire Fist is this really solid, really compact engine that's really searchable, and it's searchable within its own things because your Bear and Gorilla are getting access to your tankies, which are then in turn searching out the rest of your Bears, Gorillas, or your Dragon. And this package is just generally really cohesive. I think there is potentially another smokescreen that you could do. I think something that we've talked about is siding into like Macro Rabbit, but I don't think those cards are as viable as a smokescreen for going second. The idea behind this is you are smokescreening into a deck that can be more aggressive than your going first plan, right? Because these cards all really excel when they are going first and winning the die roll. But in the inevitable scenario where that doesn't happen, you want to have a solid backup plan. And to me, Fire Fist is that backup plan. I will say the replays that we have, I don't think showcase Fire Fist's ability to be a smokescreen super well, because I am still getting used to actually doing that smokescreen. And I think there is absolutely still optimizations to be made. But the reason that this deck profile exists at this point in time, so early on in the testing for this variant, is because I want people to be aware of it and try and cook things on their own. This is such a fascinating list. I think it's really, really cool, like on paper, and it definitely needs more tuning, but these are the kind of decks that I really want to showcase in the month of Meadowlands. Decks that maybe existed historically, but are now being completely recontextualized through a modern lens. And I think that's sick. That's like one of my favorite parts about playing historical formats as Time Wizard formats. There's just so much that can be done. That said, though, I've yapped quite enough about this. Let's see this deck in action. All right, we've got game one here. We're playing against the Gatekeeper, the end-all, be-all Machina Gadget. This is going to be a deck that you're going to be seeing a lot of in these testing cases because, like I said in the Noble Knight video, this is the Gatekeeper. If you cannot beat Machina Gadget, your deck probably still needs some work, or at the very least, it's sitting below Rogue. So we're going to start this off with Duality, Divine Punishment, Negate Attack, Meltiel, which is not currently online because we have no Sanctuary, and Honest, into our opponent's Fortress, Red Gadget, Green Gadget, Dark Hole, and Solemn Warning. We've lost the die roll, so they're going to draw into a red gadget and go red gadget to get yellow gadget. Unfortunately, they don't really have a good way of getting a rank 4 online, so they're just going to pitch the double gadgets here to get a Machina Fortress online, and then set the warning before passing back to us. We're going to draw into a second negate attack. We're going to go Duality. Duality is going to find Dark Hole, Divine Wrath, and Judgment of Anubis. We're going to grab the Dark Hole, rip that Dark Hole to clear their board, summon out this Meltiel, and set a negate attack before swinging for 16. Our opponent's turn, they're going to draw into a Veiler, which is pretty solid, actually. They're going to rip this Dark Hole, getting us off of our one monster before passing their turn and forgetting to get this green gadget on board. But we're going to go for Honest and then swing in and setting the two other cards we found because we found a Judgment. They have Avarice. They're going to go normal summon this green gadget to get a red gadget and swing in for 14. And we are just kind of playing this slow tempo game. Neither of us has anything really crazy. We find Sanctuary in the Sky, which does turn on this Divine Punishment, which is decent. They've got a Reborn drawn. They're going to go red gadget. Red gadget's going to get yellow gadget. They're going to summon out this Geargigan X, which we are going to Divine Punishment to get rid of. And then they're going to go rip this Avarice because they have enough monsters in the graveyard. Probably should have Judgmented this, but yeah, I wanted to Judgment something else. Unfortunately, I think I've held it a little too long because now the Reborn's going to come down and get the Machina Fortress back. We find a Vandalgion, which is in theory decent, but we might not be able to get to use it. They're going to go Tin Goldfish, summoning out this green gadget. Green gadget is going to get the another gadget. They're going to go Geargigan X to get a Tin Goldfish, and then they're going to swing over our Honest, but we're going to get over that with a negate attack. We find an MST, not quite what we're looking for. We're going to pop this back row, which is a Solemn Warning, pretty decent. The really unfortunate thing here is that it is really awkward to use this Judgment to summon out a Vandalgion if our opponent does not have any spell cards or trap cards that they are activating, and currently, they don't really have much to do there. They're going to go double Geargigan X to just fill their hand with a bunch of advantage. We're going to go with the second negate attack to keep us alive for one more turn. And we find a second MST, which is not what we're looking for. They're going to find an Iron Call. They're going to go to the Tin Goldfish to summon out this red gadget. Red gadget is going to get a yellow gadget. They're going to make a Maestroke to protect themselves from a potential Mirror Force. And then they're going to swing in for lethal while we go MST just to, I don't know. On to game two. So I likely played that game one very wrong. I am still getting used to this deck for sure. It is a very different gameplay loop than I am used to in Meadowlands, and it's very, very important to know what counter traps to activate at what point in time. So definitely still a learning curve for me. I do think this deck has legs, but I got to get to be a better pilot at it for sure. Game 2, our hand is looking a lot better, though. We've got Zeratius, Bountiful Artemis, Negate Attack, Bottomless Trap Hole, and a Sanctuary in the Sky into our opponent's Tin Goldfish, DNA Surgery, which is pretty interesting, Reborn, Machina Fortress, and Bottomless Trap Hole. Let's see what we've got here. We're going to go first and find a Judgment of Anubis, literally the best draw in the deck. We're going to go Bountiful Artemis, set 3 cards, and pass to our opponent. They're going to find Cyber Dragon off the top. We're going to Bottomless that. And they're going to set the Bottomless Trap Hole and the DNA Surgery, opting to keep their Machina Fortress and Tin Goldfish in hand. We're going to draw into a Vandalgion and then normal summon out the Zeratius before swapping our Bountiful Artemis to defense so we can play around a potential Mirror Force. They're going to draw into a Tin Goldfish, pitching both of those for the Machina Fortress. They're going to do a DNA Surgery, declaring Machine. We're going to go the Negate Attack here and use the Bountiful Artemis to draw a card. We're going to get a Mystical Space Typhoon here. They're going to go End Phase, and then we're going to draw into a Divine Punishment, which is phenomenal. We're going to go the MST, set this Divine Punishment, and our opponent's going to draw into Ultimate Offering. They're going to go Combat, walking over our Zeratius, and this is one of the scenarios that I was talking about where this deck does not have a good way of dealing with an established board. A lot of these counter traps are reactive to very specific events in nature. So unless our opponent overplays their hand, they are actually in a really phenomenal spot to not actually have to deal with a lot of things. We're going to draw into an MST. We're going to hit this DNA Surge to just get it off the board. And our opponent is going to draw into an MST of their own. They're going to rip it into a Judgment of Anubis, which is going to proc a lot of things. This Judgment of Anubis is going to discard the Vandalgion to negate the MST. And then it is going to also pop their Machina Fortress, and Bountiful Artemis is going to draw a card, and in the process, we burned them for 25. They're going to go Reborn trying to target our Vandalgion, but we're going to go Divine Punishment, triggering Bountiful Artemis again for another draw before we draw into another Meltiel for turn. We're going to go Bountiful Artemis and Meltiel in for direct damage, and then overlay for the Gaga Cowboy to close this game out. All right, game 3, and because we won that, we were assuming that our opponent wants to go first. So you'll notice that we have decided to swap into the Fire Fist package. We are opening a hand of Negate Attack, Force Back, Dark Hole, Negate Attack, and a Tanky into our opponent's Green Gadget, Yellow Gadget, 10 Goldfish, and Valor. 2 double ups here, which is pretty funny. But they're going to go first. They're going to draw into a Heavy Storm, which is pretty detrimental for us. They're going to go 10 Goldfish for Green Gadget. Green Gadget is going to get Red Gadget, and they're going to go overlay into a Gear Gigan X. Gear Gigan X is going to get a Weisel, which is really phenomenal for this specific scenario because we do not have a clean way of getting over the Gear Gigan X without card destruction. We're going to go Tanky. Tanky's going to get ourselves a Bear. We're going to rip this Dark Hole to get this guy off board, and then we're going to trigger the Weisel. We're going to go the Bear to try and get the Weisel off board, but we're going to be met by that Valor, which is absolutely brutal. This is going to pretty much stop us in our tracks, and this Weisel is going to try to swing into us, but we're going to meet that with the Negate Attack. They're going to go 10 Goldfish. We're going to go Force Back to get it back into the hand, and then we're going to draw for a turn. We're going to find a Vandalgion and go this Tensu, which is going to be met by the Weisel because I forgot that Weisel is once per turn instead of once while on field. They're going to draw for turn, find an Iron Call, which is pretty phenomenal. They're going to go 10 Goldfish. 10 Goldfish is going to summon the Yellow Gadget. Yellow is going to get green. They're going to go Iron Call. Iron Call is going to get the Green Gadget. Green Gadget is going to be negated. They're going to make a Die Sigma. Die Sigma is going to suck up our Bear, and they're going to swing it for 2,500. Our draw phase, we're going to find a Heavy Storm, and we can't really do much with that, so we're going to pass it over. Our opponent draws into a Yellow Gadget. They're going to go Yellow to go get Green, and then pass it over to us after going to the battle phase, and swinging for 25 with the Weisel. We're going to find a Tanky, in theory, a good draw. We're going to try to bait up this Weisel with a Heavy Storm, but they don't take the bait, and this Weisel is still online to negate our Tanky, so we are kind of screwed here. They're going to go into a Gaga Cowboy before swinging in with 25 with Weisel and then burning us out of the game, much like we did in the last game. So we lost the set. And I know I said at the beginning of the set that if the deck can't beat Machina Gadget, I think it is definitely a weaker deck, but this is one of the decks that I'm willing to give a little bit of grace to. I am certainly not the best counter fairy pilot. I have not a lot of experience with this deck, and certainly even less experience with smoke screening into Fire Fist with this deck. I do think there is some more things to be done with this list. It is very much an early build of it, but it's a really interesting concept. And while I'm not sure if it's going to end up actually making Rogue, the theory behind this deck and the foundation that it has to build on is honestly not nearly as shaky as I thought it would be. There is absolutely something here. We just have to find it. And that to me speaks volumes more than finding the 9th best Warrior Toolbox deck. This is something truly unique in the format. And while it's not good yet, I do think there is a world where it becomes good. Not meta. I don't think this is going to really stand up to Mermail, but who knows? We might find a build of this deck that actually has a chance. And to me, that's a win. I absolutely think there is something here. And we just have to keep tinkering to find it. And I am so unbelievably excited for the future of this deck because it is really, really cool to me. With that said, though, I am going to wrap up today's video. Thank you all so much for sticking around to the end. I really could not be happier with where this list is going. And I'm really, really excited to touch on it again. This might even get a scrapyard in the future, honestly, because this is one of those decks where I feel like there are so many different ways that you could mess around with it that I am really, really loving just bouncing ideas around in my brain. So that's going to be it from me, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye-bye!